Hi, I'm Lisa Bardot, and welcome back to Scene School, a free series of prompts and tutorials to help you learn how to draw scenes and discover your style one piece at a time. I'll be teaching you some helpful steps for how to design and illustrate your own scenes, and I'll walk you through how I drew this garden scene. I'll also teach you an exercise that you can use to develop your own artistic style. If this is your first Scene School video, I recommend starting with my nature scene tutorial. I'll be using Procreate today, so if you're new to Procreate, I highly recommend watching my Intro to Procreate tutorial so you can learn all the basics. And if you want to learn more about drawing, illustration, and of course working in Procreate, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss a future tutorial. Let's get started. The second Scene School assignment is to draw a rural scene. This is a mostly natural environment with at least one human-made structure. First, decide what kind of rural scene you want to illustrate. Some ideas are a farmhouse, barn, treehouse, cabin, desert home, greenhouse, lighthouse. You get the idea. For my example that I'm going to be showing you today, I'm going to draw a greenhouse garden scene. And before we get started with that, for this lesson, I also want to encourage you to experiment with your visual style a little bit. I'm going to show you what I do to get some inspiration for experimenting with my style. I keep a personal Pinterest board full of illustrations that inspire me. I went through the board and picked out some pieces that inspired me style-wise. I had a vague idea of the style in mind, something simplified with flat shapes, less realistic, but something cool happened during my research. The longer I spent going through the art, the more easily I could identify the look I was going for. The style became more solidified in my mind. Here's a description of the style that I want to try for my garden illustration. Flat, simple shapes, textured line work, minimal texture applied to those shapes, very little form and dimension, and maybe even a skewed perspective. My mindset shifted from, I'm looking at these images to figure out what I want to do, to, I know what I want to do and I can see it in these images. I encourage you to keep your own library of inspirational images and every once in a while go through and kind of pinpoint some visual styles that you can incorporate into your work. I've got an article I would check out about using inspiration and influences in your art. I'll put a link in the description to that too. So now that I've got some style inspiration, I'm going to start working on the visual brainstorm of all the different components for my scene. For a rural scene, our components are doors and windows, house or building, plants and trees, tools and objects, and animals and creatures. So drawing an entire house or building can be a bit overwhelming, so we're going to start with some of the details, and that is the doors and windows. So for me, since I'm doing a greenhouse, I looked up different greenhouses and then drew some different door and window shapes in a variety of different styles. And I'm just going to leave these as pencil sketches. I'm not going to worry about coloring them in right now. Next, we're going to work on the house or building that you've chosen for your scene. And mine, of course, is the greenhouse. So I looked up lots of pictures of greenhouses, mostly vintage greenhouses because they have a lot of really cool decorative elements and I didn't want something that's kind of modern and boring. So I drew a bunch of different little silhouettes. And then I picked a couple of my favorites and drew them out in a bit more detail with some different ornaments and things. So I have two different options to choose from. So after I sketched those out, I also really quickly wanted to test out doing my flat shapes and texture that I wanted to do for my style. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of like adding some texture to some flat green shapes to kind of get an idea of what I might want to do in the future. Next, I brainstormed a lot of ideas for the plants and trees. Because my scene is going to be a garden and a greenhouse, there are a lot of different plants going on in this scene. So the first thing I did was draw a bunch of different leaf shapes that I could possibly use for the plants in my greenhouse. And then I looked up a bunch of different reference photos of shrubs and bushes and things like that and did a bunch of different kinds of those. And then I also worked on some different trees, just trying lots of different things, experimenting with different lines to make, textures. Again, I'm trying to keep it pretty simple. And then I also might want to include some raised garden beds to put some vegetables or flowers or something in. So I was practicing with that as well. And after I did all those sketches, I went ahead and colored in some of them. And this really was just to experiment with the visual style that I want to do. I was trying lots and lots of different brushes to play around with textures of those flat kind of plant leaf shapes, and then trying a few different brushes for the line work that's going to go over the top. And I also did the same for all of my shrubs, again, playing around with different brushes, trying different textures, and then drawing in the line work over top. And of course, I probably won't end up using all of these different, plant shapes and stuff, but it's really good to do this research and experiment with lots of different styles, and then I have a lot to choose from when I am doing my final piece. The next step is to imagine what tools and objects might exist in your scene. And since I'm doing a garden, I decided to do a bunch of garden tools. So the watering can was the first thing that came to my mind, so I tried a bunch of different watering can shapes, and then also sketched out a bunch of different garden tools like shovel, boots, spray bottle, gloves, that sort of thing. And then I colored in a few of those as well. Again, here I'm still just mostly doing this to experiment with that style, to figure out what kind of brushes I want to use and how I want everything to look in the end. And then the last step of doing our visual brainstorm is animals and creatures. And there might be some wild animals in your scene, but it's also likely that there's going to be domestic animals. So I just decided to do a cat and a dog. So I looked up some reference photos online and drew these little animals that I'm really pleased with how they came out. And at this point, I'm really nailing down what that visual style is going to be. I've kind of finalized the brushes that I want to use, and I'm using them as I want to use them for these little pets. And that's it for the visual brainstorm. It's time to move on to step 2, which is putting it all together. This part might seem a little intimidating, but just take it one step at a time, and I promise your scene will come together. I'm going to walk you through how to build a scene from all the different components that you just brainstormed. The order that I recommend assembling your scene is this. First, lay of the land, then your house or building, then add your plants and trees, and then animals and creatures, and finally your tools and objects. Again, we're going to be starting from the largest things and kind of working our way down to the smaller things. So the first thing you want to do is figure out the lay of the land. And for me, my scene, it's pretty flat, so I'm just going to draw a horizon line and then move on to adding in my building. And as we're just figuring out where to put everything, I'm using very, very basic shapes to figure out where everything's going to go. And then I'm going to start adding in some like circles and ovals for where trees and bushes and things like that are going to go. So add in where all of the plants are going to be. I'm going to add a little path down here. And then I'm going to also put in just, again, very, 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 very roughly my little planter boxes. The next step is to add in where the animals will be. So I'll sketch those in very rough again. And I'm going to hold off on putting in my tools and objects until I kind of get a more refined sketch going on. So once I have everything laid out in a very basic way, I'm going to reduce the opacity of that sketch and start a new layer where I'm going to draw everything in more detail. So I'll sketch in the shape of my greenhouse and the shape of all the bushes and trees. And the shapes that I'm drawing for these plants are pretty much going to be the final shape when I color them in. So I want to make sure that they're exactly how I want them. I'll use the selection tool to kind of move things around and make sure everything is compositionally in a good spot. All right, now I'm sketching in my planter boxes in more detail, and I'm drawing these in 3D, but I'm not really worried about accurate perspective for this drawing. And for my path, I thought it'd be good to put in some stones instead, so I'm just going to sketch those within those lines that I drawn earlier. And now I am going to reduce the opacity of that sketch so I can start working on the plants that are going to be in the greenhouse. And imagining where the entire shape of the house would be. And these little circles I'm drawing are going to be like where the pots sit on the ground. This is just helping me kind of visualize where these plant pots are going to be and making sure that everything fits inside the greenhouse. I'm trying not to overlap any of the plants so they kind of all stand out on their own. And I put all those greenhouse plants on their own layer so that I can kind of manipulate them independently. So I'm going to reduce the opacity of that layer and just redraw them one more time, again with more detail. All the leaf shapes that I'm drawing come from that brainstorm that I had done earlier, where I drew all the different leaf shapes. When you're doing a big scene like this where there's a lot of different things going on, it can be intense. It can be a little overwhelming to figure out everything all at once. So doing those steps before where we did the brainstorm, we figured out all the different ways we could do leaves, make it really easy to just kind of remember some of them and use them here. And for the cat and the dog, I really like the way they turned out when I did my visual brainstorm. So I'm actually just going to reuse those sketches. So if I open up that file and I select those 2 layers, I can drag them out of the layers panel, open up my full scene over here, open up the layers panel, and then just drop those layers in. And then I can go ahead and resize them and manipulate them and put them where I want them to be. Kind of saves a little bit of time. All right, so now that I've got just about everything done, I'm going to draw in some of my tools and objects. So I think I'll just put like a shovel and a pitchfork over here leaning against the side of the greenhouse, and then a watering can near the door and a pair of boots. And I've drawn these pieces on a separate layer, so it makes it a little bit easier to move them around. So my sketch is all done. I used a lot of layers to do it, and just to kind of consolidate everything, I'm going to go ahead and merge all those layers together before I start working on my final colored piece. For my final garden scene, I'll be using a brush from my basic toolkit, some from my wash and dry watercolor toolkit, and one from my Artist Pastels brush set. I'll put a link to those in the description. And I'm going to speed up this process, but I will kind of explain some of the techniques that I'm using as I'm coloring this in. All right, I'm going to start by blocking in all the shapes with flat color. The brush I'm using for this is Bardot Inker Streamline from my basic toolkit. It's an opaque brush with a little bit of texture along the edges, and it's going to be perfect for drawing these shapes. I've modified the brush just a little bit to make it more responsive and also change the texture a bit, so maybe look out for an update to that set in the near future. So basically what I'm doing is creating all the shapes for everything in the scene, and then I'm going to come back afterwards and add the texture. And I'm placing different shapes on different layers depending on if they overlap each other or not. Anything that overlaps something else is going to be on its own layer. And I'm kind of starting at the back of my scene and working my way forward. For the cat and the dog, I drew in their overall shape in white, and then I placed a layer over the top using a clipping mask to add in their coloring. And what this just means is that I can only draw within the confines of the shape I already drew. So it's perfect for this. All right, coloring in the tree trunks. And then I decided to add some vague bush shapes in the background, just to kind of make the background look a little bit more lush. And now I'm going to get to work on the plants that are inside the greenhouse. And I will tell you that the colors that I'm using for these shapes are not going to be the final colors. I'm going to create the final colors with my texture brush that I'm going to use in just a little bit. So these are not the final colors. All right, so now I'm going to draw in the greenhouse, and I'm going to fill in that entire shape with white. And I just realized one of my bushes needs to be on its own layer, so I'll go ahead and move that. So to texturize all this flat color, I'm going to be using wash brushes from my wash and dry watercolor toolkit. Since none of the shapes are going to be changing anymore, and I'm just adding texture to these, I can go ahead and turn on Alpha Lock on all of my layers. To use these wash brushes, we need our shapes to be a light color to start out with. The way that they work is every time you layer on brush strokes, they get darker and more intense in color. So we're going to slowly build up to get the color that we want. So I'll start with a light color for this grassy area. And then using green, I'm just going to start layering on brush stroke over brush stroke, going from warm greens to cool greens to dark greens to get the color that I ultimately want for this grass. The brush that I'm using to do this area is called Stone Wash. So I'm going to keep using the same method to do all of the other shapes on this piece. So as you see me working through, I'm lightening up the different shapes, and then I'm painting in the texture to get the color that I want. So I'm starting with objects that are in the back, and then kind of working my way forward. And what I'm trying to do here is that anywhere where two things overlap, I want to have a little bit of contrast in between the green colors. So I'm using a lot of different shades of green in order to achieve this. I want it to look lush and dense with green color, but I don't want it to look too busy. So there's kind of a balance that I'm trying to strike here. I'll work on these stones now. I'm layering on some gray colors along with some brown to give it some nice earthy tones. I'm not worried about putting in too much shading because that's not really the look I'm going for. Gotta add some color to our cute little pets down here. And then I'll work on the plants that are inside the greenhouse. And I want these plants to be darker than the background, darker than what's behind them so that they'll stand out, especially since I'm gonna have like a white kind of transparent layer over them, which would be the greenhouse itself. So I want to make sure these are nice and dark so that we can see them. So all these are on the same layer, so I'm just using a small brush size to individually go in and color these so they're all slightly different. And I'm going to do all the pots in kind of like various shades of terracotta. So I'm just layering and layering on more brush strokes with these wash brushes to get a lot of great texture and also the colors that I want. All right, time to do the greenhouse itself. So I had that big white shape for the house, and I'm gonna actually take one of my wash brushes as an eraser, and I'm gonna erase most of it away to make it kind of transparent. And then I'm gonna play around with the blend modes until I get one that I think looks good. I'm using the overlay blend mode. And then I actually duplicated that house layer, the like transparent house layer, and I set the duplicate layer to a different blend mode, which was grain, and reduce the opacity of that just a little bit. I'm just kind of playing with the blend modes to give the impression that there is glass, but it's see-through. So just kind of playing around with it a little bit. And then from there, on a new layer, I'm going to draw the actual outlines of the greenhouse. And the brush that I'm using right now is from my Artist Pastel set, and it's called the Pastel Pencil. And I'm going to be using this brush for pretty much all of my line work. It's got a nice texture to it, which is exactly what I was going for. I wanted these nice flat shapes, but like with lots of texture, and then this nice textured liner to do all the detail work. So I'm basically doing it pretty much exactly how I'd done it in my sketch earlier. And I love these little like swirly ornamental designs, which I had discovered when I did my greenhouse visual brainstorm. They're really fun. They add a little bit of fanciness to it. I'm loving the way the greenhouse is looking. So I'm going to go ahead and draw in some more shapes for all these little plants in the planter boxes. And then I'm going to shade those in with my wash brushes to get them the color and texture that I want. And I think we need a little bit of soil in here, so I'm going to draw that in with a very light color at first, and then I'm going to go ahead and darken it in with the wash brushes. Cannot forget our little garden tools over there, so I'm going to draw the shapes in for those. Again, starting with a really light color because I know I'm going to darken it up with the wash brushes. I decided to do a yellow watering can and the blue pair of boots that I had done in my sketches previously. And instead of drawing two boots, I just duplicated the boot and moved it over a little bit. And then I'm going to take my wash brushes and then darken everything up and add just like a little bit of subtle shading, not too much. I don't really want to have a lot of shading in this piece. I'm going to let the detail work I'm about to do kind of give it more definition. All right, so now it's time to do all my line work. So again, I'm using the pastel pencil from my Artist Pastel set. And I'm going to first do all the line work that is dark. And I'm going to set my blend mode to multiply. And this just ensures that wherever I draw these kind of dark lines, it will always look darker than what's underneath it. It's a little hard to explain, but that's what I'm doing here. So I'm going through and just adding in some line work just to give all these some detail. I'm doing a very, very simple, stylized kind of look for everything. I don't want it to be too detailed. I don't want it to be realistic. I want it to have this kind of fun, almost childlike quality to it. And then I created a new layer to draw in some fruit shapes because I wanted to have some fruit in my trees. So I'm drawing some pears and some apples. Again, just kind of starting out with all the same color, and then I'm going to color them in even more, darken them up a little bit with my wash brushes. And then I wanted to draw some line work that is lighter than the background. So I created a new layer and I set this layer's blend mode to screen. And this will just mean that wherever I draw lines, they'll always look lighter than whatever I'm drawing them on top of, as long as I use a light color. Blend modes can be a little confusing, but they are really, really handy. I would just recommend experimenting with them. Like as you can see here, using the blend mode for this bush in front of the greenhouse wasn't quite working out. So I'm just going to put that on its own layer and turn off the blend mode. And I think that looks a lot better. And then I'm back on my screen blend mode layer and I'm drawing in just lots of little lines for grass. The lines should get a little smaller as we go closer to the back, where the back trees are, just to show a little bit of perspective, where things closer to you are bigger and things that are farther away should be smaller. So little touches like that will help to give it just a little bit more realism. And of course I need to add some line work to my cute little doggo. And I'm basically doing it exactly as I had done the other day when I did my brainstorm, kind of figuring out how I wanted to draw the dog and the cat too. I had a lot of fun with those. I think they're really cute. I need to put in some detail line work over on all these little tools. And of course, cannot forget about the plants in my greenhouse. I'm going to add some lines on the actual plants themselves and stems and all that good stuff. On these leaves, I used my eraser to kind of erase away parts of it. Same thing over here on these like Monstera type leaves. Got a little snake plant over here. Some generic plant. I don't know what's this called. I just thought it looked cool. And then we got to add stems for everything too. And I'm almost done here. I just need to add a little bit more line detail down here on my planter boxes. And this is looking really good so far. The last thing I'm going to do is just going to go over the whole thing and make sure that everything is as dark or as light as I want it to be. So you can see here I'm just kind of like adding more strokes of the wash brush to make things a little bit darker or lightening things up, just to make sure everything looks good. All right, this is my finished garden greenhouse scene. And a scene like this is definitely something that's very difficult to just up and draw. You do need to go through the process of figuring out all the different components like I've shown you, and then tackling a scene like this can be a little bit more approachable. I hope you enjoyed following along with me for this drawing and you're inspired to draw some scenes of your own. You can learn more about Scene School on my website. I'll put a link in the description. Scene School is a part of the Making Art Everyday Challenge, a free series of daily drawing prompts, tutorials, motivation, and a supportive community, all with the goal of helping you overcome your creative fears and establish a daily art making practice. Learn more at bardotbrush.com/joinMAE. If you're posting artwork to Instagram made with my brushes or tutorials, I would love to see it. Use the hashtag BardotBrush. And for this tutorial, don't forget to use the hashtag SceneSchool. Thanks and happy art making! If you like this video, please subscribe for more awesome tutorials. And check out one of my other videos. Have a great day!